other concepts and key terms that occur within Lacan's mirror stage essay that we sometimes kind of bypass or don't really investigate further? Well, one of them is the notion of the imago. And I'm just going to give the quote, and then we'll try and offer a couple of descriptions of what this imago concept entails. So we're on page 76 of the full translation of Decree, and Lacan makes a specification there about identification. It suffices, he says, this is about the third paragraph on page 76, it suffices to understand the mirror stage in this context as an identification in the full sense analysis gives to the term, namely the transformation that takes place in the subject when they assume an image, nice choice of words, an image that is seemingly predestined to affect at this phase, as witnessed by the use in analytic theory of antiquity's term imago. So there's imago, he puts it in inverted commas. He says an image that is seemingly predestined to have an effect at this phase. Now let's bear in mind that when in an earlier piece of writing, when Lacan is talking about family complex, relations that develop within what he calls family complexes, he used the imago a lot, and he gives it a certain, it always seems to give it almost like a behavioral template of how to deal with a certain kind of situation. But here he's mentioning is seemingly predestined to have an effect at this phase. So there's something about an activating quality or that the imago brings with it. What though is the imago? In Danny Nobis's footnotes, he says, in Latin, the term imago has myriad meanings, ranging from image and likeness to deception and semblance. So in a way, it's surprising that Lacan doesn't use it more, although presumably one of the reasons he doesn't need to use it more is by the time he develops and further articulates the notion of the imaginary, it's going to do a lot of the kinds of pieces of work that this term does. But let's just keep that in mind. The myriad of meanings includes image, likeness to deception and semblance. And those last two sound very much like the imaginary register. Callum Neal has also got something to say about the notion of what an imago is. He says, page 140 of his text, in psychoanalytic terms, the product of identification would be termed an imago, a Latin term that denotes a developmental stage of maturity, such as the butterfly in relationship to the caterpillar, as well as in ancient times referring to a death mask. The term imago would also connote an idealized image, as in imago Dei, an image of God. Lacan appears to be drawing on these multiple senses to paint a picture here of a process of identification which marks the distinct movement to another phase or stage of experience through the internalization of an idealized but fabricated idea. The identification which takes place then is not an identification with what is. So I think that's probably the best way we're going to have to try and specify what's going on with that term. So I'll just read Neal's most crucial description there. Lacan is drawing on multiple senses of the term to paint a picture, and here's the crucial point, of a process of identification which marks the distinct movement to another phase of experience through the internalization of an idealized but fabricated idea. So there's something idealized about it. Okay, good. I think that's an important further qualification that we want to make. A further concept that we maybe sometimes don't pay enough attention to in looking at the mirror stage essay is the ideal ego. I've tried to stress it a couple of times, but let's see how Lacan talks about it. Page 76, the jubilant assumption of the specular image by a kind of being still trapped in their motor impotence and nursling dependence. Okay, really crucial points in terms of the mirror stage. Like there's a kind of necessity of taking on the specular image because I'm still so much within my motor impotence and nursling dependence. I can't do anything. I can't handle myself, and I'm fundamentally dependent, hence the need to take on this image. The jubilant assumption of this image seems to me manifest an exemplary situation in the symbolic matrix in which the I is precipitated in a primordial form, prior to being objectified in a dialectic of identification with the other. So there's an interesting moment here when I'm kind of captivated or seduced by or take on, assume, as he puts it, an image, because at this very early stage of development, I am stuck in nursling dependence and motor impotence. So I take on this image, it gives me a kind of coherence, and that in a sense logically precedes the dialectic of identification with the other. So there's an initial assumption of an image which is kind of going to precipitate and push me into the dialectic of an identification with an other. Because you could say that in the first taking on of the image, that gives me this kind of bodily map and sensibility of an I. That's me. I'm not quite yet being pushed into this more social dialectic of identification. But let's stay with the ideal image that one wants to assume for a while. And of course, that whole notion of an ideal image that one wants to assume has a kind of narcissistic quality to it. And it also reiterates once more Neil's point that the image that one takes on is not a kind of necessarily a realistic image. It's not objective in that sense. It's got this kind of narcissistic quality, this idealizing element to it. Back to Lacan's text. This form would have to be called the ideal I, if we want to translate it into a familiar register. In other words, he's trying to say, or is saying, this is a term that already exists within the Freudian lexicon, although presumably Lacan wants to lend it a degree of precision. So, okay, so this is the form that one wants to take on of the image, the ideal I, the ideal ego, we could say, the idealizing image. The important point, though, he says, is that this form situates the agency known as the ego prior to its social determination in a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible for any single individual. Or rather, that will only asymptotically approach the subject's becoming, no matter how successful the dialectical synthesis by which he must resolve, as I, his discordance with his own reality. So, very Lacanian sentence, a little bit complicated, but there's a couple of brilliant moments there. This form situates the agency known as the ego prior to its social determination. So that's the second time, remember when we spoke about the dialectic of identification, where there's an initial assumption of an image which occurs before this precipitation into the social. So just to note that. But also this fantastic way that he describes of being pushed into a fictional direction. Not only then must I take on an image, I must take on an image that has fictional qualities to it. And furthermore, I will only ever asymptotically approach. I might get close. There might be moments when it feels like that image and me are kind of the same thing. But ultimately, this will not result in a sense of harmony. Ultimately, the approach may be an approach, but it's an asymptotic approach, which means that it never quite gets there. No matter how successful the dialectical synthesis by which he must resolve as I, his discordance with his own reality, there is no fundamental resolution. So what is noteworthy, I think, here as well, is that what we're seeing is already, he doesn't use the terms as such, but he will go on to describe how this approaching of one's ideal image, or this chasing of one's ideal image, is never going to be successful. And he will say this, he'll recapitulate it in slightly different terms a little bit further on, but it seems as if we're getting the fundamental psychoanalytic and Lacanian appreciation of a real, of a kind of impossibility, of a non-harmony, which is already apparent here in the mirror stage. Okay, so let's just give a Danny Nobis quote to highlight something of this, and then we'll go on to ask ourselves something about the relationship between the Umwelt and Inwelt, the surrounding experience, the environment in which the person, as we've been speaking about earlier, locates themselves, and the domain of inner experience. So this is from Nobis, it's on page 115. He's talking about the aspects of immobility and the Gestalt. So actually, let's just quickly do this. This is our next point on the list that I am constructing. When we name check the concept of a Gestalt, when we think about the mirror stage, what is meant by it, and what do we say enough about Lacan's relationship to this concept? So here it is in the mirror stage, page 76. For the total form of his body, by which the subject anticipates the maturation of his power in an image, is given to him only as a Gestalt. That is, as an exteriority in which, to be sure, this form is more constitutive than constituted. More constitutive than constituted, but in which, above all, it appears to him as the contour of his stature that freezes it and in a symmetry that reverses it. In opposition to the turbulent movements with which the subject feels he animates it. Another one of those lengthy sentences which contains some real crucial terms. Okay, but number one, is given to him only as a gestalt. What do we mean by that? What does he mean by that? What is this distinction between this form is more constitutive than constituted? What's going on with that? And then what is this idea of the freezing it in the contour of his stature that freezes it? So a couple of questions. Nobis goes about thinking about these points in a very helpful way. He says, Lacan highlighted the aspect of immobility shared by the Gestalt in the mirror image in order to contrast this to the turbulent movements that the subject feels are animating him. This is yet another way to explain why the mirror stage is attractive for the child. When adopting it, the internally felt disturbance can be steered in the right direction. Through its identification with a static mirror image, the child can channel the libidinal dynamism of its organic insufficiency. The fixity of the mirror image can also be inferred from the rigidity of the me to which it gives rise. So let's just make a very basic point. Let's say if there's some discordancy of experience, and I'm guessing that's kind of inevitable, one of the things that makes the mirror image an attractive option, or you could even say a soothing and calming option, is that maybe there's something within it that seems a little more static, relatively speaking, that seems to give it something to hold on to, which is not characterized by the same discordance and the same turbulence as is qualifying their experience. So that's, I think, one of the points Nobis is making, but the further point there is also to say, well, that highlights a further disjunction. Because if there's always going to be this disjunction between the ideal image and my own bodily domain remit of experience and lived experience, we could say that there will also be a number of different distinctions between the image that I take on, which is presumably the ideal image, so not, objective, but the image as presumably seeming to be a little more static and less turbulent than my own experiencing. But you could also say maybe there's a kind of mismatch because it is relatively static, says he, being static, as opposed to what is the fluidity and nature of my own experience. So number one. But you could also say then that maybe there's a potential time lag of sorts, that the image that I assume to make sense of myself and my experience might be a little bit older, even if only by a few seconds, than the remit of my bodily experience. Here's my silly example of that, which I've already given elsewhere, is going outside, putting sunblock on, thinking I'm going to be all fine. I know you've heard this before, but whatever. And then coming in and realizing I didn't do these bits. In other words, the image that I thought was of me was a kind of earlier, younger, whatever, hair loss Derek. So just to emphasize that, both the need to take on an image because it gives us this containing, stabilizing, relatively static thing, but also that in that respect, in as much as its formal static qualities is not quite the same as the fluidity and chaotic ongoing set of moment by moment experiencings of me, that means there's a mismatch, and also there's the potentiality of a slight time mismatch. Let's also note, and I think this is something that is really important about the mirror stage, is that it also gives me a kind of bearing in terms of temporality. You could say, maybe this is something that has become something that has been realized through a sort of druggy experience, that the way that gives continuity from one moment to another, that's something that, given the right number of drugs, doesn't necessarily make sense. There can be discontinuity from one moment to another moment. The consistency of an unfolding temporal experience doesn't quite work. Whereas I think the implication is, even if there is a bit of a time lag, relatively speaking with a mirror image, there's something about a succession of images that helps me track and keep temporal experiencing consistent and unfolding. Even when that experience probably doesn't tally with something that's underwriting the actual nature of one's experience. For example, if something is traumatic. So we've said a little bit about that, but we still want to say something about the quality of the Gestalt. Why is the Gestalt important? What is Lacan doing with that? I'm going to just take another quote from Nobis, and then we'll point to a really crucial description that Nobis offers in this respect. So here is Nobis again, and he's talking about the Umwelt as opposed to the Inwelt. And so, of course, what we're talking about here is the Umwelt, the environment, as opposed to the domain of kind of lived inner experience. But here he goes. The me, says Nobis, is exterior, because its matrix does not arise as an internal awareness of bodily status, but as a Gestalt within the child's Umwelt or environment. Insofar as the Imago appears in a mirror, it is inaccessible because it has neither depth nor contents, and one can neither manage nor wield it. In addition, the Imago is complete. Unlike the child, it has no insufficiencies, and it also seems to enjoy the comfort of having nothing to demand or desire. Yet the mirror image does not exist outside the virtual space in which it locates. So I suppose we've covered a lot of these points, but maybe the fundamental idea here, whether one wants to get kind of in the weeds of the details, is that there's going to be a kind of formal disjunction. There's facets of the image, in Nobis's terms, that doesn't have depth, doesn't have contents, and that it seems complete. Those formal facets of the image are different and contrast to the lived experience. Okay, but of course you could say then that this is part of the reason why the image is so attractive. Now, let's just quickly speak about how Nobis wants to talk about Gestalt. This kind of is absolutely crucial to me. Lacan refused to adopt the principles of Gestalt psychology, according to which a form is constituted through the organizing perceptive functions of an individual as a means of explaining what happens during the mirror stage. Hold on, I thought we just used the Gestalt. Let's stick with it, because Lacan does use the notion of Gestalt, but in a qualified way. Back to Nobis. As Lacan puts it, the mirror stage does operate for the child as a Gestalt, but this form is certainly more constituent than constituted, and it appears to him above all in a relief of stature that fixes it. In other words, here's the moment we've been waiting for. In other words, it is not the child who constitutes the Gestalt, but the Gestalt that constitutes the child as a me, and the form itself is fixed or static rather than mobile or dynamic. So this, he'll go on to say a little bit more. It's on page 114. This is really helpful because we do often make use of the notion of the Gestalt in thinking about the mirror stage, but it's not so much that there is a kind of master in control of this process, a kind of pre-existing ego which says, here's the Gestalt of that, how it fits everything together. Rather, that the outcome of this experience is that the Gestalt has constituted the child. So to reiterate that, it's not the child who does the work of constituting the Gestalt, but the Gestalt that constitutes the child as a me. This aspect follows directly from the fact that Lacan conceived the child as a premature, dependent, and uncoordinated creature. Claiming that the Gestalt is constituted by the child would presuppose that it functions ab initio as a relatively integrated agency, which is exactly what Lacan wanted to counter. To Lacan, relative integration in the form of a me was an effect rather than a cause of the mirror stage. An effect rather than a cause of the mirror stage. So just to highlight that, the notion of the Gestalt is crucial. It is operative, but it's the Gestalt that constitutes the child rather than the child who constitutes the child. Okay, so we will stop there, having added another 2 or 3 crucial ideas, the 3 ideas that we focused on to add to our conceptual richness of how we engage the mirror stage: ideal ego, Imago, and Gestalt. All of those are helpful, and we'll return with one further set of comments.